Thank you, and I just want to thank the MPI for the opportunity to be here. This really is an honor. I can't remember if you mentioned I was here a couple years ago, and it was a wonderful time. I got to see quite a lot of the two different islands, and I was really happy, really, to be able to come back only after 2 years to be able to see it again. Well, one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about food defense and some of the things that the U.S. government has learned and adopted over the last 15 or so years. But before I get there, there was an article in a magazine, Science magazine, a couple months ago, where what they did is they interviewed 60 experts in the area of bioweapons. And they asked them a series of questions. And one of the questions they asked was they wanted them to assess what's the likelihood of there being a large-scale biological weapon attack within the next 10 years. And large-scale meaning that it would result in over 100 individuals dying as a result of the event. And of those individuals that responded, there was a mean of close to 60%. So basically what they were saying was maybe not 10 years, but within 18 years there would be an event, most likely that was large-scale and involving bioweapons. When they talked about this, they also identified the fact that if there was an event, it would be covert in nature. And the individuals that would perpetrate it wouldn't necessarily be a government. They would be some unidentified group that wasn't part of any specific entity. When asked the type of individual that would be the perpetrator, it turns out religious extremists was towards the top, but followed very closely, and actually within a standard deviation, were right-wing activists, disgruntled employees, and mentally ill individuals. Here's a graph of the responses, and I'm not going to spend much time on this, but there's two things I want to sort of point out. One is if you look up towards the top, there was at least 3 people that were confident, without a shadow of a doubt, that there would be an event within 10 years. The other thing, even though there's a few individuals that thought the probability was low, nobody put 0. Everybody felt there was some probability associated with the biological event happening within the next 10 years. Another thing they were asked was whether or not that event would have some prior knowledge as to when it would occur. And most of them agreed that the intelligence community would probably not be able to determine or have any foreknowledge as to when the event would occur. And primarily, I think as an understanding, was the fact that a lot of this information tends to be classified. And moving classified information and all of the pieces of classified information into one location in order to put the assessment together as to whether or not there's an event is very difficult. Now, this group wasn't asked to look at this in terms of food. They were looking at any potential biological weapon, whether it be aerosol or water, whatever. But when I read this, I immediately started thinking of food, because I could see food being a vector that could easily be used in order to create a biological weapon. Now, before I get into the rest of my talk, one of the things that we've found is that there's some confusion with terminology, partly because the whole concept of food defense is still relatively new. It's getting better, though. But just so that you know, food security, which some people have used associated with food defense, we tend to use that more as we've already been using today from the standpoint of is there sufficient food available for the population, and does it have the sufficient nutrient quantity? Whereas food safety and food defense are more from the aspect of whether or not there's harm that's done to the individuals. Just to sort of give an analogy of the differences between food safety and food defense, I think this helps most people to get a better grasp on what food defense is involved with. Because food safety tends to be a failure of the system, where food defense is purposeful. Someone has sat down and actually thought through what they're going to do. It's an attack. Food safety has microbial and chemical agents along with physical and radiological, and so does food defense. But we see on the food safety side, those agents are fairly well known, where on the food defense side, The same well-known ones are there, but then there's also a sea of potential unknowns that could be used with regards to a food defense incident. On the food safety side, a lot of times the levels of contamination are low, where on the food defense side, typically they're very high because you want to have a major impact, and so you do that by loading up the product with the agent in order to have that impact. Food safety is relatively likely to occur. We see it every week, where food defense is relatively unlikely to occur. However, the impact is much higher. So food safety impact, we tend to live with that, where food defense impact would be catastrophic in some cases. On the food safety side, there's a fairly strong, at least in the US, presence of the regulatory agencies because they deal with this on a daily basis. Well, in food defense, and we'll see this in a second, there's sometimes some confusion as to whether or not incidents of food defense or food safety, but as soon as it's recognized as food defense, that needs to kick over into your law enforcement individual. It needs to be turned over as fast as possible to a criminal investigation. Because if you wait too long, then the conditions under which the event occurred are lost, and the investigation becomes that much harder. Food safety, there's regulations that are already present, where food defense in the US, they're just starting to come about. One of the things I wanted to talk about is the fact that even though there's some differences between food safety and defense, I alluded to it a little bit earlier, is that it's sometimes really hard to know what you have when the event is occurring. If I were to just hand you these incidents, if I were to write up a little brief summary and just hand them to you, assuming you didn't know anything about them, but I have a feeling most of the audience know a little bit about each of these, you would probably have a hard time knowing what was going on from the standpoint of the event. The first two, you would probably consider them to be food safety. The last one, you'd probably consider a public health event. But it's not until after we really analyze what's going on do we see that the first one, which is the incident in Germany a few years back with regards to what appears to be sprouts, where 54 so individuals died, that was a natural food safety type event. The terrorist event, this happened in the United States and the state of Oregon, where there was a religious group, Randishi group, that for purposes of trying to persuade the government, actually was contaminating the sites that they ate at with Salmonella typhimurium. What you might know is it wasn't a one-time event. They did this a number of times. They actually had a lab in one of their buildings where they actually grew up the Salmonella in order for them to perpetrate their events. And the last one, actually that for a long time was thought it was they thought it was a public health. Well, it turned out it actually was a cooking oil in Spain that had been diluted out with machine oil, and it was very hard to trace. And as you can see, it took so long that there was over 600 deaths as a result of that. Another thing that happens, not only do we not necessarily know what type of event is going on, we also have a hard time knowing when it happened. The same as for food safety. If I were to plot a food safety or food defense incident from an investigative point of view, you'd see a graph like this, where the product is produced, it's consumed. Some time after that, you start to see illnesses. And then again, sometime after that, you start to see the public health group start investigating. And often they'll peak in their investigation when the product is already gone. It's already out of the system. There's not much they can do. It's sort of the event has run its course and it's over. Here, just an example of that. This is the Salmonella outbreak that happened in the States with spinach. You can see there that there was some point, we don't really know when, the spinach got contaminated. A few days later was your first event. And then over the period of the next couple weeks, you saw a spike in the number of individuals that were coming down with the illness. And then the expiration date was September the 4th. So all the illnesses are almost starting to dissipate. The product now has probably left the shelves, or people have decided to throw it out. And it's not until a few days after that that the health officials actually identify that there's an issue, and then another week later goes by before they even announce it. So we've got this problem associated with how we're able to detect what's going on with the event and also with regards to when it occurred. The next thing I want to mention, we already talked about it a little bit earlier, is the supply chain. This is also very problematic. If I look at the superficial level of the cheeseburger supply chain, in other words, just the cheese, the condiments, things like that, I have a fairly limited supply chain diagram. It sort of looks like a mess there, but it's not that big. If I were to hear that a terrorist were to tell me that they've contaminated that supply chain in 3 places, I've now, because of that, I've now have over 48,000 potential scenarios that I might have to go through in order to be able to know what actually happened. If I add the supply chain of all the ingredients, which means the manufacture of the cheese, manufacture of the pickle, the ketchup, the bun, all of that, now my scenarios go up to close to 2.5 million different possibilities. So it becomes really hard to try to control that supply chain, which what Alan really saw already this morning from the standpoint of the meat incident. The other thing that becomes really hard for us when we're looking at defense is the individual involved with it. For food safety, often we get a pretty good handle on accidents in Mother Nature, but when we're looking at an incident that is purposeful in nature, that individual has different agendas, whether it be a disgruntled employee or a terrorist or an economically motivated activity. I found this rather interesting when I first got involved with this, is that prior to about the 80s, anytime you talked about a terrorist event, people assumed that was purely a military function. You know, it wasn't going to affect me. I wasn't in the military. We weren't going to see it in our backyard. But it wasn't until really the Rajneeshi group started in the 80s, and then it's been perpetrated again and again after that, that you now see that these terrorists, the way I put it, is they've lost all ethics. They don't care who their person is. They'll target adults, children, infants. They really don't care, which is really a sad commentary. But now they've taken what traditionally had been a military mindset and put it into our backyards, and now it's becomes a concern to us. The terrorists, their intent is to create fear, is to draw attention to themselves. They want to disrupt our normal way of life. They're also usually rather bright. They're very good at their job, if you want to call it a job. They work, in other words, they are able to put together the resources they need in order to be able to carry out their intent. They also don't tend to do it just one time. They will tend to perpetrate their terrorist activities over and over and over again. Just an example of this is some documents that were seized by the US forces in Afghanistan in 2002 from an Al-Qaeda camp. You know, when you first look at this, you probably don't realize it's in English, which really sort of bothers me, because where was the individual that put this bioweapon plan together trained? But we see closer, there's some information here on this one note from the standpoint of where would I go and get that organism? And they've actually listed the traditional culture collections that are available where they could just put in an order and have the organism shipped to them. The other thing that, one more. The other thing, no, I went too far, sorry. The other thing that they've done is they've started trying to encourage their coworkers to take whatever actions necessary to do their job. This is a little quote from a terrorist propaganda video that was released last year, and it turns out the video itself, it wasn't like shot with a single camera against some guy standing in front of a flag. This was a professionally done propaganda video. And in it, they encourage those that are like-minded to poison the water or the food supply, and if necessary, to run over people with their cars. These people have an agenda. When you look at disgruntled employees, they don't have the same type of agenda. Really, them, it's based on anger. Their intent is to damage your product or to actually fight back at you as an individual if you're a company executive. They're usually internal employees, and they're very familiar with your process. Here's an example of an incident that happened in Japan just a couple years ago. There was an individual, he was a seasonal worker. He took melathion in a bottle and hid it in his sock as he entered in the building, and when he knew that he wasn't being watched, he contaminated a whole bunch of products. Went almost 2 months. The sad thing is it appears as though there were people in the plant that were aware of it, but they never said anything. Economic motivated adulteration, we've already heard a lot about that. They're motivated to make money. But one of the things that I wanted to bring out in this is that when they do that, they try to hide what they do. And they try to hide it in such a way that they're not detected. So if they're familiar with your procedures that you would have in place in order to measure certain things, they're going to try to circumvent that. And they always aren't interested necessarily in causing something that would hurt a person, but sometimes it does. As this example, which we're all very familiar with melamine in infant formula. Food fraud takes a lot of different pictures, from dilution, substitution, mislabeling, transshipment, that would be where they move it from one country to another and say it's made in that other country, counterfeit, theft and resale, and intentional distribution of a contaminated product. That one doesn't sound like an EMA type event, but that's where we put it because it was intentional. They purposely let their product ship even though they knew it was going to cause a harm. I'm not going to spend much time on regs in that's going on in the FDA. We could take all day, but I just want to sort of point out that after the act was published, the U.S. government had to start writing publications. There's, rules. The one rule that isn't finalized yet that's going to impact this area the most is the intentional adulteration rule. The other ones are also going to impact it, but not quite to the same extreme. That's foreign supply verification, preventive controls for human food and animal food, produce safety, third-party auditors, and sanitary transportation. Just a highlight here, for some odd reason, within our office, we don't understand this. FDA decided to separate EMA from other types of intentional acts of adulteration, and they put it in the preventive controls rule. And it's clear in this particular, when you read the reg, that they intend for industry to prevent that from happening with regards to a supply chain control program. One of the things I thought about is given the opportunity here and talk with you, was to also share as best I can just some real learned lessons, what works, what doesn't work, from the standpoint of how the government needs to do their job, and also how industry needs to be able to take some tools and use them internally. I would say probably one of the things that comes to the top is that if you think about this, you've got a government now with multiple agencies all doing their job. You now have to implement a food defense type mindset. Well, the only person that really is going to be able to do this effectively is the president. So the president initiated a series of president's directives, and the way it worked was in these directives, you would convene these panels, and they would then draft the directive. And the directive would say, okay, this agency is responsible, but you have to work with all these other agencies. And this one here is a pretty big one, which has to do with development of a framework to protect, prevent, protect, mitigate, respond, recover from incidences that would be defense related. Now this isn't just food, this is across the board. There's 16 critical infrastructures. The nice thing about this though is that it now creates the responding entities to have the same types of plans regardless of the event, no matter whether or not it's food or transportation or energy. Some of the things that I've seen as being some of the essentials when you're thinking about a food defense system is, number one, I've seen this over and over again, is that there's communication barriers and you need to knock those down. That's probably your number one priority, because without that communication freedom, and that's within the government to local health authority, within the government and industry, those need to be taken care of. The other thing is that contrary to food safety, I think there's a large push to try to make industry responsible for food safety. When it comes to food defense, the government's really the one that has to be the leader in this case. Because companies can't embargo things, companies can't seize things the way the government can, companies can't force their competitors to stop what they're doing. The other thing I've seen is that when the government puts forward the programs to create these systems, that they're not always thinking in terms of sustainability. They like to create, and then they sort of let it die on the vine. Well, when you create it, you need to think in terms of how it's going to stay there long term. And then there's this infrastructure that needs to be put in place. Just so that you know, there's, over the 15 years in the US, there's lots of tools available for the food industry with regards to more of the elements associated with prevent, protect, and mitigate. There was a lot of work done by the FDA in conjunction with the Department of Defense to come up with an assessment tool. It's Carver plus Shock. It's an actual it's a software tool. You can download it off their website. FDA actually worked with industry, and they did a whole slew of assessments with the Carver plus Shock tool, and they came up with the mitigation database. So you can actually go online now, and if you know what your process is, they've got some recommended things that you can put in place in order to mitigate any potential food defense event. They've also taken the Carver plus Shock tool and they've tweaked it a little bit, and they've made it a little bit simpler, and they've created a food defense plan builder. All of those are free. The other thing that Homeland Security and FDA and USDA all invested heavily in is being able to detect agents. Like if you go back when the first incident happened in 9/11 and people started brainstorming, well, what happens if I take this pesticide and stick it in a food? What happens? And everybody would go, well, I don't know. Well, a lot of work has been done in that area. We now know a lot about how to detect that agent. We know how it survives in the food processing. We actually have kits available now. There's kits that measure ricin and all slew of kind of food products, all currently available. The other thing the government did is they invested heavily in a system of laboratories that could detect the presence of contaminants. And basically they partnered with a lot of the states, and they not only trained them, but they gave them equipment, they validated methods, they do routine testing of those labs to make sure that they're still able to do their testing. And the other thing they've done is they've established a monitoring program where they're actually looking for contaminations on a regular basis. With respond and recover, that's probably one of the areas that still needs a lot of help. I think the reason for that is when you think about it, you learn by having instances, and there are not very many instances where you can actually exercise your respond and recovery program. But the thing that I think I've tried to encourage, and I really like what Frank was mentioning today, is that this culture is going to be the same. Whether it's food safety or food defense, that culture from the standpoint of training your employees to not let someone idly walk through a plant without the need to be there, reporting that individual, stopping them at the gate or whatever is necessary. And also there needs to be a constant exercising of any emergency response plan or recall plan that you have in order to make that it works. One of the things that we found when you're dealing with large, major events is that you can recover. It's not always easy, but you have to remember that you're going to recover to a different normalcy. It's not going to go back to the way it was. It's going to be different, and actually that's the best thing you can do is to plan for that different recovery, knowing that it's going to be different. I don't have much time left, and I really wasn't planning to spend much time on these, but at our institute we do a lot of research, and I just thought I'd share some of the tools that we have also. A lot of the tools I already shared with you were available more from USDA and FDA. We've got a couple software programs that we've been working on. This one is we call it a critical spatial analysis software platform, and what it does is it allows companies to take their supply chain, fit it into the program, and then the program uses information about where the different components of the supply chain are, information about where certain risks might geographically be higher than others, And it allows you then to look at your supply chain and identify where your high vulnerability points are. Another thing that we have is getting to this whole idea of trying to push our ability to detect more towards the front of that bell-shaped curves that I showed earlier. Is we've got a program called FIDES that's looking at, you can't just take epidemiological data and attempt to know what's going on. You've got to take other data, and this program takes things like political information, weather patterns, what happened from the standpoint of whether or not a plant shut down, things like that that are looking for opportunities where you might have an event that occur and try to predict that in advance. Last thing I'm going to share with you is we've got a database where we comb the internet and we take that information from the standpoint of economically motivated adult-oriented events, and that's in a database. This is going to be very useful when it comes to implementing your preventive controls from the standpoint of knowing what type of history's gone in the past for what types of events and what the food product that was involved in that event. Recently, Yogi Berra died. I don't know how many of you know him, but he was an individual that has a very different kind of wit. But I thought this was one of his quotes that really sort of fit in here well with us, just because in food defense, we often tend to ignore it. We don't tend to want to put the effort in because we don't see the outcome. But I thought this sort of fit well. If you don't know where you're going, you might wind up somewhere else. With that, I appreciate and thank you for the opportunity to be here.